You are now listening to Out of the Blank.
Well, Samantha, welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I want to kind of introduce you and also kind of get what you do professionally.
Thank you so much for having me, Robbie. I'm really excited. So I live in Florida. My day job is an in-house attorney for an insurance company focusing primarily on first-party property insurance disputes. But in my spare time, my friend Megan and I, we do a podcast called Literary Lushes, which is a bi-weekly episode where it's essentially a drunk book club. We get together, we make a signature cocktail inspired by the book that we're reading. We post that video up on YouTube, and then we record our podcast session. If we're lucky, sometimes the authors are gracious enough to join us. If not, then we just have a good time shooting the shit and gossiping while getting drunk and talking about the book.
Yeah, it's a relaxation way because the way you said your job at the beginning, that's difficult. Like that was just tasking just to listen to. It sounds like, you probably go through a lot of stress throughout the every single day.
Yes, you see all those memes online where it's like the lady and she has her fingers out and the comment is, as per my last email, bitch. And it's like, yes, that is me on a daily basis, being, professional, but maybe slightly passive aggressive if it calls for it. It's important, in any industry to have a professional and friendly relationship with the people you work with when possible. But every once in a while that it just doesn't work.
Well, I mean, it gets difficult because that's a very overwhelming kind of spot. You're dealing with people, like you said, first party property liability, right?
I used to do some liability work. Now it's mostly property claims. So if you have a damage to your house and you report the claim with your insurance company, and you don't like the outcome and you sue them or threaten to sue them, then we get involved. So it's not very glorious. But sometimes we get some interesting cases and it's not life or death. I have friends who do liability. I have friends who deal with people who have cancer and mesothelioma, and I have friends who do the criminal field, and I give them credit because I could not do it. It's too real for me. So property is good. It's like, okay, your toilet leak, big deal. We'll figure it out.
It's difficult too because it's also links in with insurance fraud. A lot of people like kind of setting their house on fire or saying there was more stuff in the house when it did catch fire, so they'll get more on their insurance money back.
Right. And I live in Florida, and the insurance industry is very lucrative down here. And for a very long time, we had a huge fraud problem. And that predates me a little bit, but I've heard stories where people would paint tea stains on their walls and ceilings to make it look like water stains. And you would hear stories about people knocking on someone's door and being like, hey, you want a new kitchen? Okay, like leave your house for a little bit. And then, they'd start like a grease fire and the kitchen would explode. Just like crazy, crazy stories. So yeah, insurance fraud was pretty rampant. I think I haven't seen too many cases of it since I've been doing this, but it's still around. There are very legitimate claims, and then there are some not so legitimate claims. And most of the time, people's claims are legitimate, and it's just a meeting of the minds as to what really happened and what the damages are valued at.
Do you help out the company or are you helping out the person?
I was once told I work for the devil, so I'll let you guess which side I work for.
Okay. I mean, it's really, really hard because there's always like, you really have to read the printed line under it. Like, I feel like every time I'm trying to buy something, buy one, get one free. And then it's like the small print says, oh, but you have to with a purchase above $50. It's like, oh, I did not read the fine print, which makes insurance very, very difficult to deal with. It's like you don't want to have to deal with the hassle, but you want to know you have that safety net too.
Exactly. And just like any field of law, it's so fact specific. So just because, we live in Florida, so we have hurricanes, just because your neighbor's house was damaged by the hurricane and their insurance company paid them for a new roof doesn't mean your house had the same damage, doesn't mean your policy is the same, and doesn't mean that your insurance company is going to pay you for it. And that's something that we see all of the time. And I always feel for the people when they have damage to their house, but then, you have to be like, well, your house is different than your neighbor's house, different building materials built at different times. They might have been in a more direct path, yada, yada, yada. So yeah. And then they'll be like, oh, I didn't know my policy covers this, or I didn't know my policy doesn't cover this. And granted, I've never read my full insurance policy cover to cover, which I probably should. Most people probably don't either. And even if they did, they probably wouldn't fully understand what's covered and what's not.
It's so much easier. It's just like when you're going through an article or something that says, please agree to the terms and conditions. You just hit, I agree, and then keep on going through just so you can get to what you want.
I think South Park did an episode about that with the iTunes agreement, like a while back, because iTunes would always, I felt like every other day, come out with a new agreement. And one day I was like, let me just read it. And I think I got 2 sentences in. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I might be signing away the rights to my first child, but I'm going to take my risk.
It really makes it scary when you look at advertisements for anti-depression medicine or some type of anti constipation thing. It's supposed to be a laxative, and it's warning, side effects include, and then they have some guy that sounds like a salesman, at an auction or something, going once, going twice. He's just reading off a list of effects. You're like, wait a minute. There was an acne cream for teenagers, and the thing was major depression issues, like suicidal depression, and there was bloody diarrhea and all these things that were terrible. It was what's worse, acne or dying a horrible death?
Yeah, I think about that all the time. You see, especially with the erectile dysfunction ones, and it's oh, may cause kidney failure, heart failure, blindness, baldness. You might lose a leg, you might lose an arm, you might have to give up, eating shellfish. I was is that really worth it? But, sometimes I guess the trade-off is worth it. But for some of the minor ones like acne, I don't think it's worth the risk personally.
I think it's definitely important to read the kind of everything, making sure before you sign on the dotted line. But I still don't do that anyway, even though I know so much about of what they could trick me with. Like you're saying with insurance, it might be different from your neighbor's house. If you have fire home insurance, if your house burns down, did it burn down from this or did it burn down from this? I'm what's the difference? It burned down. Well, your policy doesn't cover that.
Right. And this may be boring, but it happens a lot with plumbing leaks, right? So a lot of the policies have differences between whether it's a backup of water or an overflow of water. And one might be covered, but one might not be. And then, so of course, the argument is it a backup or is it an overflow? If water comes out of your sink, is that a backup? Maybe. Is it an overflow? Who knows? But I guess if it was that easy, I'd be out of a job. So I'm okay with it.
Do you find that most of the time you feel like you're conflicted because you still have the kind of the moralness? If you could tell someone's hurting and their policy doesn't cover it, but you really want to help them out, but you still have to kind of stand your ground because it's your job?
Sometimes, like I said, most of the time, if the homeowner's house sustained true damage that was covered under the policy, most of the time they were paid something. If they end up, filing a lawsuit, usually we reach some sort of favorable outcome for all of the parties involved. It's been rare that I've seen a case that it was just flat out denied because it was just completely not covered. Most of the cases I've seen were things because they just neglected their home and they didn't maintain it. For example, we see cases all the time where the roof is over 30 years old, and living in Florida with hurricane season every season, even if a storm doesn't come through, we still get a lot of rainstorms. We still get a lot of wind. We get tornadoes sometimes. A 30-year-old shingle roof is in, bad shape. And then they wonder why they have a roof leak, and the policy doesn't cover wear and tear. It doesn't cover neglect. It doesn't cover your, failure to maintain the property. And, a lot of times the water that they see has been coming in for, months, if not years. And in those cases, I'm like, well, I feel bad for you, but also, you own your house, you have a duty to maintain your house. And if you're not going to take care of your house, why should your insurance company take care of it for you?
Exactly. So you can kind of see rights on both sides. You just got to hope that, that people aren't taking kind of the extra road with other people, not taking them for a little bit of a joyride. So this kind of like hops onto something because like that's a kind of a very stressful job. Mostly because of the tents, you kind of feel like you feel drained probably at the end of the day, which you probably turn to with your podcast, writing and reading, first of all, um, literature. I mean, that's not something a lot of people do nowadays.
Which is crazy to me because my brother and we grew up loving to read. I have very fond memories of going to the library with my mom, for like story time when I was, 5, or going to pick out books to bring home. I still have my library card. I still get books from the library all the time. I have my membership to Barnes and Noble. My boyfriend and I, we have a couple bookshelves that are overflowing with books, and it's sad because we don't really have any like extra wall space to put another bookshelf up. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoy reading. I like audiobooks as well. And it's it's just a way to learn about other things, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, right? You get to escape your world and do something else for a while, but in the comfort of your own bed.
Well, I talk about it's just like a movie. I mean, I got really into reading when I started kind of, mine came from playing video games. I mean, I was playing a game called Assassin's Creed, had an alternative history outlook to things. But video games, movies, they're all basically storytelling, which is the same thing a book does.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite poems by Robert Hayden Frost, Those Winter Sundays. I'm experiencing that now that it's becoming like deep into winter. You're feeling the cold in the air, the chill. It's getting the climate's changing, and you're starting to see like what he was talking about in his poem about the cold cracks of the winter chill on the window glass, and he basically explains being curled up into his blanket like a cocoon, looking out the window and seeing all of this and feeling cold and all that. And, just searching for heat in his body. For me, having ADHD, I'm a good reader, but I have a very difficult time trying to keep my mind on one exact thing. And as I was hitting into college, I started realizing like, there are some stories out there. If you really kind of keep your mind focused on the first line, you can get wrapped up into them. And it's like an escape. Next thing you know, you've read the book and the day's gone by. And you're like, wow, that had me trapped that whole time. And it was amazing.
Yeah, I remember my brother and I are avid Harry Potter fans, and I remember the last book came out, and it was a hefty book. I don't remember exactly how many pages, but I think over 800. And my brother was like, I'm going to read it first because I'm going to finish it before you. And I was like, you're fucking crazy. But he bought it and he stayed up all night and read that whole book in one sitting overnight. And I woke up the next morning. He's like, here you go. It was a great book. I hope you enjoy it. And I wanted to like savor it. Right. So I like spread it out over I think like a week or two because I was like, I don't want to finish it because I know it's the last book of the series. And he just like blew through it and just, from dusk till dawn finished that book. But yeah, it's a great escape, and it's a good way to, just relax and, like I said, learn about different things because you could find a book on any topic at all.
Yeah, well, for me, not spending $400 on like a watch or something like most kids my age. I actually go to thrift stores and spend what, $1 and get like 20 books. I mean, I own the whole Percy Jackson series. I own all the Stephen King books. I literally, just from going to a thrift store and taking the time to actually read into these things. I'm a big fanatic when it comes to Greek mythology. So, like reading all the Percy Jackson books gave me that alternative kind of look. And a lot of people don't understand that literature does not mean like, oh, a play by William Shakespeare. No, it can be a comic book. That's still literature. That's still an art form. I mean, all this came from a Greek philosopher named Aristotle, our whole comedy, tragedy, all those things. And it's just adapted more days. Like there's so many kids nowadays that are becoming writers because everyone has a thought to express. The fact that a book could impact you in such a way where you can literally get legit emotion off of it.
Oh yeah, I think it's great. So we, I was telling you before we started recording, Megan and I, we did a couple interviews earlier today for our podcast, and we have a segment that we do intermittently, and it's called the Author Spotlight segment, which we didn't realize until we were recording that the acronym for that is ASS. But besides the point, the gentleman we were interviewing, his name is Jason Gwynn, and he is a lesser known author. He has 3 books out, but his last book was the first one that was published by a publishing company. The other 2 he self-published, and he was saying that in today's world, it's so easy to self-publish. You could actually go on Amazon and do it in like half an hour, and
Yeah, it
you're done.
explains why every person that wants to be a part of my podcast keeps sending me their Amazon bestseller. I'm like, how many books are labeled a New York Times bestseller? I thought that was only supposed to be like a once a year type thing, but it was like they called it Book of the Year. It's like Times Magazine called it Best Movie Out. I was like, but everyone says that in their movies.
Yeah, you probably should do some fact checking just to make sure, that it's not like their mom being like, this is the best movie I've ever seen.
Well, actually, learning a little bit more about literature, I podcasted with a guy who's a ghostwriter. And that was interesting to know that people hire other people to write their memoirs and write their biographies for them.
And even write some of their books, like James Patterson, for example. A lot of his books will say James Patterson and, insert name here. And that's because it's a ghostwriter. They help them formulate their ideas and I guess put pen to paper to make it into the literature package that you get at the end of the day. So I give them a lot of credit because it seems like you have to take someone else's idea
And
and
life in a way.
yeah. And, I think we've all been there where we've had to work with someone who is telling you what they want, but not in the way that they think they're telling you. And so everything you do ends up being wrong because they're not communicating to you what they need. And putting that in like a high stress writing situation where there's contracts and deadlines involved must be stressful.
I think it's a little bit kind of stigmatized by younger generations, especially people not reading books when they get older, is because it's so forced upon them in school. It's a requirement, obviously, which it should be. It's because something nobody's ever just going to pick it up and be like, "Oh, I'm going to read a book one day." No, they kind of have to kind of dive into it themselves, and that's what expands their knowledge to have that idea to pick up a book in the first place and decide to read it just for fun. We have to learn what that is. Like they forced it upon me so much in school. I just never wanted to read a book. I never even took the time to until I found something I was interested in. Learning the Dewey Decimal System I thought was going to be a major benefit in life. I don't think I've ever used it since. And there were so many books. One really impactful book I would have to say that really expanded my mind and got me just going down the road of psychology was dealing with, it was called Inside Out by, the first book I read was called Cruise Control. And this author talked about this kid who had a little brother that was mentally disabled in a wheelchair, and it felt like he was unresponsive to anybody. All he did was make noises and yawn and drool on himself, and he was basically like kind of holding down the family in a way. And he was this basketball star, going to college, and he was afraid to go to college because he would have to leave his mom with his little brother, and he basically hated his brother. But if anybody messed with him, he would step on, like he would protect him immediately. And it was amazing to see that from a first person perspective. This guy talking about like, oh, my brother, look at him, he's drooling at himself again. And like just the hate he would say for it, but really the deep down love that he actually had for his brother, and watching his character development through the story. And then I read the second book to that series was Inside Out, coming from the brother's perspective. And the brother was like Stephen Hawking's, like super, super smart, but could not express it.
Mm-hmm.
And getting that was like, it blew my mind and started having me chase down the at least mental health in a way, and the brain and all its understandings. Why is it that these things work in different ways and people are more functional than others? And it expanded my whole knowledge on at least a lot of what came to the human brain.
And I think that's why reading is so important because it puts you in the mindset of someone else. Again, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, And I think that's why, when we're in school, we have, the mandatory Shakespeare and, Lord of the Flies and all of those, good books that are sometimes a little bit dry and sometimes a little bit over our heads when we're in high school. But if, I went back and reread some of them. I reread Catcher in the Rye recently, and I reread The Great Gatsby recently. And I can appreciate it now that I'm older, but I think that's, obviously part of the reason why is to not only cover the classics, but, expand our repertoire. If it was up to me, I'd probably read sci-fi, fantasy, and historical fiction like 99% of the time. So it's good to go outside your comfort zone and learn new
Why
things.
would you personally choose those over others?
I don't know. I just enjoy it. I like the historical fiction because it's history, but sometimes those straight up history books can be a little bit
bland. Yeah.
A little bit dry, bland, and a little bit heavy. Depending on how they're written. And the historical fiction is just a little bit lighter a lot of times because the author has that creative ability, that wiggle room, right, to fit the history to the story or fit the story to the history. And so, they can fudge the events to make it, fit, but it's, still the overarching story is true.
Yeah, they want to Hollywood it up a little bit so it's more entertainable for an audience rather than just spouting facts at you like a history book does. I mean,
Exactly.
the history book basically does the same thing. It only shows the winner's side. It doesn't show the losers. It doesn't show the other people that are suffering. I mean, most of the stuff that I started diving into research-wise with history came from other people's history, Russia's history, all these amazing people that we don't even know about because it's not part of ours. I mean, it's crazy how far a book can take you. I remember that show Arthur where it was like, you're not cool unless you have a library card. And I didn't truly understand that until I became older and I actually signed up for a library card and was getting books on my own for school. And I was like, wow, there's so much knowledge here. Like so many people writing down their thoughts, their research, whatever you felt like chasing down after. I mean, when I was in school, I just took advantage of the easiest books to read, the one with a lot of pictures, which stumbled me across a bunch of these comic art books that were like they weren't paper, it was hardcover, and they would teach you about like the Mayan history, and they would draw it in a comic book form, and it taught me about the gods and all these religion type stuff where I started kind of looking at philosophy in a way and all these people that think differently. But do you find more of a fascination with first person perspective or more of a third person perspective?
I guess it depends. I like both. Some of my favorite books are from the first person perspective, and some aren't. I think for me, it's more of just the story and the way it's told. But what you were saying is absolutely true. You kind of go down this rabbit hole, right? Like my boyfriend and I, we really enjoy mythology. He's very interested in Norse mythology, and he was reading Norse mythology books. So he read the book Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman and then was like, oh, Neil Gaiman also has this book called American Gods. And that book is incredible. I don't know if you've read that one, but it's a great story. And then, from there, I discovered the author Brahm, who has some really good books. And he has a book called Lost Gods, which is kind of a similar thing. And, all of a sudden you're a certain amount of time down the road and you've read all of these books, fiction, historical, whatever, but about, what's is, I guess, overall the same subject matter. But as you go down more into like the niche genres, you get some variety and then you come out the other side having way more knowledge than you ever thought you would about a random topic. And then you notice it in other areas. So, Megan and I, for our very first episode, we covered the book Helen and Troy's Epic Road Quest by A. Martinez. And it's about a Minotaur high school girl and like this, the idea of a perfect like jock type boy, and they are chosen to go on an adventure together. And I was reading the book and I'm like, okay, this interaction sounds a lot like Baba Yaba with, the old lady in the house with the chicken legs who tries to like cook children. And we actually got to interview Lee, and I asked him, and he was like, "Oh, absolutely! Like that was based on Baba Yaga." And I was like, "Oh, if I had not like delved into this random mythology tangent, I would have never have known that." So reading is good.
For sure. I mean, Romeo and Juliet, there's one right there, major one taught in schools. Everyone kind of is like, oh, we got to read this, but they end up getting captured by just the star-crossed lovers aspect. I mean, the ending, like killing themselves for each other out of love, like it was something that was like, wow. And they don't really hit you until you become older and you truly have kind of the, I guess, wantingness to know more, but also the keen kind of perspective and curiosity to start reading more, which I really think sucks that it has to hit you kind of when you get out of school, because you have so much of this vast knowledge in your own like environment around you when you're going through school. I mean, the library is right there, but not a lot of kids see that because they look at recess, obviously, the stuff you see as a kid. But it's crazy to see that you see a lot of parents when they go and drop their kids off at school now, they'll walk into the library and start looking at books like, oh, what do they have in here?
Well, and I think it boils down to you have to find what you're interested in, right? Like people like different genres. That's why there are different genres. I personally don't like romance novels, but I have a ton of friends that love romance novels. And hey, if that is your interest, if that's what you like to read, cool, do you. I have people who, read only nonfiction and they like, the really gory, depressing history. And I was like, cool, tell me about it when you're done, but I don't want to read a 700-page book about this genocide in this small area of the world. Like
the
I read
Trail.
Yeah. I just, that's too heavy. I want an escape for what I read. So you have to find what you like. And I think it's also, the people you hang out with. If your family and friends aren't interested in reading, you don't have any, exterior social influences telling you to go read. But I think also in today's day and age with social media, it makes it easier, right? Like there's so many movies that come out and I'm like, this looks like a badass movie. And then I'm like, oh, it was a book. And then I'm like, okay, I want to read the book before I go see the movie because I feel like that's what you should do. And I think these days with, Google, it's very easy to do something like that. So
especially now everything's being recorded online nowadays. I'm not talking about World Star Hip Hop. I'm talking about like now they have a comic book app you can get for your phone that I have. I have all the Marvel comics on my phone. So I don't need to go buy one, but I can sit there and read them. I can look at so many different comics that have come out. I can look up a book, the Amazon Kindle, that whole thing, I don't like how it took out a bookstore because still I like the feeling of a nice book. The paper aspect to it, you hear the crinkleness of the paper, like, like the flips of the pages or something.
The
like
smell of the paper. Yeah.
like that feeling of the paper, like it's something, it gives a little bit more texture to what you're reading as well. And, I forgot, my dad's a giant fan of the band Kiss. So he got one of the very few books that ever came out that was written by the band, but the first 100 that were printed were written with the band's blood. The ink was the band's blood.
Dang, was it a long book?
No, it's not like they drained them and sat there. No, but they used a vial of each of their bloods and they put it into this ink. And the first 100 books were made with that ink. And my dad had one of the copies, and just reading that and then hearing that through them, you really, really felt like, they legit were in the room with you. But like
that's some metal shit right there.
Yeah, but it was like that's how far they went though. Like I've read biographies from Steven Tyler's biography to Anthony Kiedis's biography to Slash's biography, and they all talk about their whole entire experience. And this is when I started realizing like I wanted to do podcasting too, because I'm very lazy. I don't want to really read that much unless I'm really interested in it. But I found that this was a way for you like Samantha, to be able to tell me your story, tell me, this is the history of Samantha I'm talking to, a conversation with you. And it's like that with each individual guest. And it's like, yeah, it might be selfish of me, but what do we consider elderly people? They're historical books. I mean, they have so much information, so much experience, so much knowledge inside of them. Like they say, reading is power. It is power. It's knowledge. It's all about experience.
And learning about history so we're not doomed to repeat it. Um, and I actually, my grandma, she is from Germany. She was born in the late 30s, so she was very young when World War II was going on, and she moved to the States when she was, gosh, I think like 13. And her stories about growing up, she was one of like 12 or 13 children. They were very poor. She would tell me stories about how they would sneak into like the neighbor's farm to steal fruit from like the orchards, and her stories about coming in the United States with essentially nothing and, making a life for herself. It's like unreal. And I always told her, I was like, one day I'm just going to like put a tape recorder, but okay, maybe now just like a microphone and a computer in front of you and just let you talk about your life, because I want to preserve it so that I can learn everything there is, because if you don't tell me, nobody ever will.
Yeah, one of the weirdest things I always thought about my great grandfather that I ended up doing after just being influenced by him so many times. He grew up in the Great Depression. So he didn't have much. So everything he had, he saved. And every meal he ate, he made sure he ate every last bite. So we got a bucket of KFC chicken one time, and he's sucking on the bones of this chicken, like basically eating the bone as well. And I was like, why do you do that? There's plenty here. And he goes, you don't know what it was like to have nothing.
Right. And those are important lessons to learn, whether you get it from a book, a documentary, a family member, or, a stranger at a bus stop. It's important to learn history, our own and others, so that, we can strive to make the world a better place and not make the same mistakes that some people did in prior generations. And history is important and fascinating, like 90% of the time. Not, a lot of the stuff that you don't learn in school is actually arguably more interesting.
Yeah,
but.
like Christopher Columbus bashing babies on rocks and stuff. You're like, whoa, 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 this isn't the Christopher Columbus I learned about. And it turns out he was a complete idiot. I mean, the only he
Yes.
lied back to everyone to tell them that there was gold, and there was no gold. He did it because he knew he was going to have a ride home. They were just going to leave him there. It was going to be like the concept of the Martian, just going to a planet and then leaving him there. Like it was crazy to even read that myself on my own, and I had to go and read that. I was like, this should have been taught in school. Would have made me want to read a little bit more about stuff. But definitely wanted to check something before I signed it.
And that's why I like historical fiction, because it gives you insight into something. And then for me personally, after I finish reading it, I find myself researching the topic it was about. So in addition to Literary Lushes, the podcast I do with Megan, I'm also in a real life book club. And a lot of the times it's either history related or historical fiction. And we just finished a book called The Other Einstein, which is about Albert Einstein's first wife that a lot of people didn't know about. And she, went to school, went to college in the 1800s and 1900s, when it was like unheard of for women to do that. And she was a mathematician in her own right. And some people think that she helped influence or helped Einstein with like his relativity calculations. And so I read the book, and, the author did admit at the end that she took a lot of creative liberties based on, things that were happening at the time, and like the letters between Einstein and his wife to create this story. And I finished the story and I'm like, wow, this woman was like badass. And then I went and I started reading all about her. And then I started reading all about their kids and like the Einstein like family tree. And he ended up like marrying his cousin after like him and his first wife got divorced, and, just like this crazy stuff. And I never would have read any of that if I hadn't read The Other Einstein, the historical fiction book that my book club happened to pick for this month. So you never know where it's going to take you.
Plus, having a reading group with friends is it's really, really weird to understand how people work, but we all have a social skill inside of us all. If we don't really work on it or we don't interact with that social skill or interact with other people, it fades down and it gets really kind of creates a lot of issues mentally. But when you create a book club and you start reading with friends, even though if maybe you just read silently to yourselves, you don't really talk, you just kind of enjoy the books you guys are trying to reading. It does kind of turn into a little bit of a competition too, but it also makes it fun, like to see who can get farther in the book, who can see who can get where, who's a faster reader. People read at different paces, and it was always kind of something like for me, I was in like an alternative education types class. So there was a small group of us. They only put me in there because I just couldn't sit still. So they were like, we can't have you in a normal class. So we're going to get you in a different one. So they put me in this different one with the kind of the slower readers. And half the time we barely even read the books really. We were just sitting there just talking about random things about life, like the whole Fresh Prince skit. Like before they Will Smith got his role on the Fresh Prince, they asked him like, what do you want your character name to be called? And remember, whatever you choose is what people are going to know you as for the rest of your life. So he chose Will Smith.
Yeah, no pressure or anything, right?
Yeah. And that's why Carlton as Carlton, not Alfonso. And
Right.
it's just having those little tangent conversations, but then reading about the books and like seeing the different paces where I would be finished the book and then everyone else is still like the bird went across, and I'm like just sitting there like, oh man, can I get another one? Then eventually I started diving and doing my own reading because I found like it was a little bit of a competition of myself to see how many books I could read. And yeah, I was still picking like the short ones but the comic style ones, but I started learning so much information where I was like, actually, that was in a book I read. It's actually this. And then, it helped so much to my benefit where I started seeing like knowledge. Like eventually I did a spinoff of this podcast called Fill in the Blank, where I focused on specific topics and I would ask each of one of my guests, pick something you're interested in. My buddy talked about Victorian 19th surgery. I was like, what?
Oof,
Like,
that sounds
how
rough.
the hell do you pull that out of anything in the world to think of to be interesting? You pick out 19th century Victorian surgery.
It's actually,
it's very interesting.
yes, and horrifying.
Yeah. So I looked up a book and it's called The Art of Butchery by Lindsay Fitzharris. She was on a Joe Rogan podcast, which I'm a big fan of. So I decided to read her book. I learned all about Robert Liston and Joseph Lister, these innovators to the basically medical industry back then, and the fact that they were keen on cleanliness. When they used to take you to hospitals, it was seen as a place to die because
It
hospitals were
was
so contaminated.
filthy. Yeah, they didn't know anything about contamination or nothing.
These innovators of it, Joseph Lister was named. He was actually the name inspired for Listerine, and it was he only had a good concept when it came to cleanliness. When it came to, he would just run his tools underwater and decide to clean off some of the blood, but he never thought to use hot water. This is before they even thought about that. But I'm learning all this while reading a book, and I'm
right.
like,
And
how is this
you're grossly
happening?
fascinated.
Yeah, and it's like you don't want to stop. Like, next thing you know, it's been an hour. It's like, oh, it's getting dark out. I probably should get some sleep. You're like, no, I got to read one more page, at least finish the chapter. Then it's like, maybe I'll finish the next chapter after that.
That's like, so I also like to read those like wilderness books, I guess, for lack of a better term. So Into the Wild, Wild. I I read this book called The Oregon Trail, which was about two brothers who, in the mid 2000s, so somewhat recently, built a covered wagon and trekked across the Oregon Trail like they did back in the day. And it was a very interesting book, but it got bogged down with some of the nitty gritty details and, unnecessary history of like horse breeding. But that was very interesting. But I also read a book recently called Stranger in the Woods, and I cannot remember for the life of me who the author was, but it's about America's last quote unquote hermit. And this guy's story is just like, I'm reading it and I'm like, this is a true story, and I still don't fucking believe it. And this guy back in, I think it was like the 80s, he was always a loner and just drove his car into the woods one day and got out of the car with essentially no possessions whatsoever in Maine, I think. So, cold weather, and never looked back, and lived there in seclusion for 30 years. And in that time, only had a conversation with one other person when he crossed them on a hiking trail. And like all they said was hi to each other. And that's it. And, spoiler alert, he got caught, obviously, because otherwise there would never be a book about him. But the book is about how he survived. And it's just insane. And, one of those things where, I would never experience something like that. So it's very cool to learn about. And then, you pick up some survival tips along the way, I guess. So I recommend that book.
I mean, adding more information, I think like I learned so much, at least looking up, things that I've seen in movies and being like, I wonder what this is. And next thing you know, it turns out it was a book. Well, then you end up reading the book and you're like, whoa, there was so many things that are different. It really changes your aspect of things. So if you read a book and then see the movie, you're like, oh, the movie did it differently than the book did. But then if you see the movie and you read the book, you're like, the book did it differently than the movie did. Even though usually before it's a movie, it's a book. J.K. Rowling's whole series, all that Harry Potter series, and it was like reading that and then watching the movies, it was a completely different thing because I saw the movies first.
Yeah, I think the only movie and book and movie that to me were essentially the same was John Dies at the End by David Wong.
That's a good movie, though.
It's a book. I don't know if you read the book. It's
I have not, but that movie tripped me out way too hard.
And yeah, I'm pretty sure he just took acid and then wrote down his thoughts. And
my God, Paul Giamatti turns out to be not Paul Giamatti. It's like, whoa.
Yeah, so I saw the movie first and I'm like, this is a ridiculously incredible movie. And then somebody was like, do you know it's a book? And I'm like, get out. And so I read it and it's essentially spot on for the movie. And then he has, I think it's like a trilogy. And I read the second one, which is just as crazy as the first. And I haven't gotten to the third one yet. The third one I think is called This Book is Full of Spiders or something like that. But yeah, that is the only book movie combo I can think where, you could essentially watch the movie and be like, yes, I also read the book because it's basically the same.
Have you ever been reading a book and then started to feel like it was like affecting you, like your environment around you?
Yes. Especially if it's, so I like the paranormal. I like, stories about like ghosts and haunted weird history and stuff like that. And I just, I read the Haunting of Hill House. There's that show on Netflix. There was that movie back in like the 90s called The Haunting. It's all based on this book. And, it's about a haunted house. And then, after I read that, any like creak in my house would be like, oh my God, what is that? It's a ghost and they're coming to, kill me.
It's like the movie Interstellar. After I saw Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey, I was messed up on life for like 2 weeks after that. I was like, what? Imagine if there's a planet out there where an hour on our planet is 7 years on that planet. And I was like going deep into space. I was like, I'm like going Neil deGrasse Tyson right now. And it was like, I got that from a book like that Robert Hayden book I was telling you about. Like I felt cold. I knew what that feeling was, the cold air filling up your lungs, like if you were taking a puff from a cigarette and you felt it fill up your lungs, the cold air doing that. I mean, I think we've all walked outside and like taking a deep breath and it's like we just brushed our teeth and we're having that mint fresh feeling. Like it's amazing to see that, just the feeling you can get from just reading words written down.
Oh, yeah. We, Megan and I, on one of our episodes, we talked about One for the Money, which is part of the Stephanie Plum series by Janet Ivanovich. And it's about Stephanie Plum, who is from New Jersey, and she's a former lingerie buyer turned bounty hunter. And the first book takes place in the 90s, so before, social media and cell phones. But in the book, there is this very, very creepy, cringeworthy, misogynistic character. And every scene with him, I would get goosebumps and like an upset stomach reading because it was just so unsettling what he was doing in the book, that there were points where I would just have to like put it down and walk away and then come back and then put it down and walk away and then come back. And that happens to me, with some books. And then of course you get the opposite reaction, right? Where you're reading a book and it makes you feel all warm and fuzzy, or you start laughing so hard, you end up crying because it's just hysterical picturing what's happening in the book in real life. So yeah, reading is a very powerful medium to get your point across. And, I think, like we were saying before, when you're younger, you may not have the emotional capabilities or range to fully understand it. But as you get older and go through different life experiences, and you're able to relate a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's one of the most surrealist experiences. I mean, it's just reading a book and then like if a character dies that you've been connected to from the beginning, it's just like watching a movie and your favorite character dies or something. You get impacted by it. Like afterwards, you're like, shit, I can't believe that just happened. It feels
Oh,
like
it's devastating.
it feels like the only context that stays the same is books have remained and had that character usually always in them. But with movies nowadays, it's kind of being taken a little bit harder for people to fall capture to something and be connected to a movie nowadays. But you could always be connected with a good book.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we actually just interviewed Dennis E. Taylor earlier today. He is the author of the Bobiverse series. The first book in the series is called We Are Legion, We Are Bob. And the whole premise of that is it takes place in the future where this guy, he paid to have his head frozen Walt Disney style, so that in the future, they could recreate his body. And he wakes up to find out that his consciousness has been uploaded into a computer system for a spaceship. So he's essentially AI for a spaceship to conquer space. And the book has a lot of humanizing factors about, imagine what it would be like waking up 150 years in the future. Everybody is dead. And, oh, by the way, you are now AI. So you no longer have a body. You no longer have emotions. You can't eat. You can't drink, nothing. And I had like a little bit of an existential crisis when I was like reading this. I'm like, in the beginning where he's going through like all the feelings, I'm like, oh my God, like I would probably lose it. But it's reading can put you through things that you would never otherwise experience, I guess.
It's an escape to another universe, basically. It's like opening up a doorway somewhere, and you hop right in. You're gone. You're in a different reality.
Exactly. And, it's like music is a very powerful tool, especially for nostalgia purposes, where you can listen to a song and immediately be transported back to, the first time you listen to that song, or a specific time in your life where that song was playing, and you just immediately transported back. And books can have that same effect too, where you're reading what the character is going through. And if it's something that you've been through or something similar that you've been through, it can transport you back, for better or worse, right, to that same thing that you went through. And then it helps you sympathize with the character that much more.
Yeah, I definitely think there's no better feeling, to be honest with you, than reading just a good book. Sometimes that's better than being on the phone and just staring at, mindlessly scrolling through Instagram and reading everybody's complaints on Facebook. Why don't you take the time to read a good book?
Oh yeah. I always perpetually have a stack of like 6 books on my night table that I'm like, these are the books I'm going to read, and whether or not I get to them is another story. But I definitely prefer reading to, I mindlessly scroll on my phone as well, but I prefer reading than Instagram scrolling for sure.
Well, Samantha, it's been amazing having you on the podcast. And I want to give you here a minute at the end to kind of promote your podcast too.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. So I know I've kind of shamelessly been mentioning it the whole time. But our podcast is called Literary Lushes. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. So we're on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play. Our hosting platform is Podbean. We're also all over social media. So we're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Like I said, it's a bi-weekly podcast where we talk about a book. We also do a signature cocktail with each book, and we do a YouTube video that goes up on our YouTube channel. And the cocktail is inspired by said book. So for example, with the We Are Legion, We Are Bob, it takes place in the future. He's in space. My dog is grabbing a really loud toy, so I apologize. And the guy Bob, because he's AI, doesn't actually have to drink anything, but he always seems to have a coffee in his hand in this VR world that he creates for himself. So we created a coffee martini for the drink. And then, we get together and we talk about the book. Sometimes the authors join us and we get to pick their brains about their book and the literary process. Sometimes they don't. And like I said, we also just started a new segment where we have fledgling authors come on to give them a platform to talk about their work. So if you or anybody would be interested in doing that, please let me know. And we also have the option available for people to come on to talk about their favorite book. So if you're like, this book is the bee's knees, and I would read this book every day for the rest of my life. If I was stranded on a deserted island, this is the book I'd bring with me. Come on the show and talk about it, because if you're that passionate about it, then everybody should know about it as well. And that's what we do.
That's a wonderful concept. And like I said, it's been awesome having you on. I mean, I definitely think if people definitely need to look up your content, because first of all, I mean, drinking and then also reading a book, I mean, what's more relaxing than that? Come on.
Oh, and it's a lot of fun too. A great excuse to make a sometimes questionable cocktail, and you just have a good time with your friends and you get to read. So, and again,
nothing's destructive when you're reading a book while doing it.
Exactly. And it's a good way to get out of your comfort zone because you're reading books you might not otherwise pick up. So it's a win-win. But I had a great time, Robbie. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.